I'm here today to speak with you a little bit about my relationship with Odin. I often get questions about what it's like to be owned by Odin, or how I knew I was owned by Odin, and what it's like navigating that relationship on a day-to-day basis. So I thought that I'd answer a few questions and maybe help other people out there who find themselves in the same boat.
So when did Odin first come into your life?
95. He started courting me, and it was very much a courtship. He is a god of dangerous charm. He started coming for me in 1995, and he courted me. It was a quicker process, I think, than I realized at the time, but he courted me until I fell in love with him. And then he snapped me up and he bound me to him closer than I ever thought possible. I'm fortunate. I think Loki very much paved the way for my relationship with Odin, and he helped me calm down and open my heart and trust. I trust Odin. I trust Odin to be Odin.
So you're actually a wife of Odin. You're married to him.
I am. And it's hard to say whether that defines my relationship with Odin, or being his Godatheo, a god slave, defines my relationship with Odin. It's never just one thing. There's so many different levels on which we relate, and each one has its challenges and each one has its rewards, but no part of that relationship exists in a vacuum. But yes, I am wed to Odin. And that keeps me going when the rest of it gets very difficult.
So tell us about Odin. He's got a lot of different faces and names and aspects. Which ones do you interact with?
I probably interact with Gangleri the greatest, or Ygr, the one who hung on the tree, the rotting corpse of a god who died and came back after winning the runes. I deal with the rune master and the shaman. I deal with the king and the wanderer. And at his base nature, he is hunger and territoriality. He is a hunger for everything, every scrap of knowledge, every iota of power. He is the raging territoriality of the storm wind that gives no quarter and asks for none. I've dealt with his eldest aspect, the god that took up weapons and slew his ancestors because he could, because they were there, because it gave him the chance to create and claim for himself part of the worlds. That's the god that I serve. And he is ruthless. And I love him.
So, people who said that they want a patron deity, do you think that everybody gets one, or how do you go about that happening?
I think that most people who say they want a patron deity have no idea what it is they're asking for. I think that we have a choice in those gods that we love. We can show devotion to any deity that we want to, and that is a good and right thing. But to be claimed by a deity, we don't get to choose that. They choose that. And that's also a very, very beautiful thing, but it's a much more complicated thing. And it comes with many more challenges than a simple, unfettered, devotional relationship. You don't have to be claimed by a god to love a god and to pour out offerings for a deity. But if you are claimed, there are obligations, and sometimes there are taboos. And as deeply as you pour yourself into that deity pours him or herself into you. And that can be a very terrifying and life-changing thing.
Well, what would you advise people? How do they go about finding the right god for them? Do they just wait? Let it come?
Well, I would say start with getting your ancestral house in order, because if you can get it right with your ancestors, They will show you how to get it right with the gods. And by it, I mean the protocol of respect and humility. If you can get it right with your dead, they'll show you how to get it right with the gods. Sometimes you don't have that choice. Sometimes the god does come calling. Or sometimes, like, maybe you're like me. Maybe it's easier for you to hear the gods than to hear the dead. Then pray and meditate and do your rituals and pour out your offerings and just try to live mindfully. Ask for the connection. There's nothing wrong with asking. The worst that can happen is that you'll be told no, not now. Ask for the connection and then be ready, because a deity just might have been listening.
So what does Odin ask you to do?
What doesn't Odin ask me to do? Seriously? I was having a discussion with a colleague recently, and we were talking about how you can tell if someone is really owned, flat out owned by a god. And we decided that the way that you can tell is they're terrifyingly productive. You know, people say to me, you've written so many books and you have 15, 16 projects that you're working on, and you're in grad school and you're teaching and you're doing this and you're lecturing here. I'm like I have a choice? Odin asks me to wear many hats because he wears many hats. He asks me to wear many hats because there's work to be done, and there aren't enough willing hands to do it. So what does he ask me to do? Anything he happens to need done at the time that I have remotely the skill set for. And I'm happy to oblige. You know, sometimes in my clumsy way, but whatever needs to be done.
I was doing some research for my school project and came upon the idea that the character Santa Claus was based upon St. Nicholas, and that St. Nicholas, at least in the Germanic countries, was linked with the character of Odin, this ancient Scandinavian god who at the time I found to be extremely scary. And again, I was 8, and I had an experience, and I don't know to this date whether it was a dream or it was an actual tangible experience of meeting him at that point, and I was equally drawn to him and terrified. He's the kind of god who, much like I've heard followers of the Morrigan say about their goddess, he haunts your nightmares. He hides in the dark corners of your dreams, and he continues to do so until you acknowledge him and welcome him into your life, or at least deal with whatever message he's brought you. But I was 8 years old, so at that time, I wasn't really ready for any of this. So I kind of blocked the whole experience of meeting him out of my memory. And much later, when I was in my early 20s, he returned under a different guise entirely. And again, he is a shapeshifter. And at that time, he romanced me, and I accepted him, and we were married. And I did not know him as Odin at that time, but I know since then that he is the same being. And I know how fruitcake this sounds, and I expect thumbs downs on this video, and I've told the story on my blog. I don't care what anybody thinks of it at this point in time. This is my experience. It doesn't have to match anyone else's, and I'm fine with that. And if you don't like hearing about it, there's plenty of other YouTube channels. But anyway, so I married this spirit who was a king, a warrior, a sorcerer, a guardian and guide of the dead. And he had another name that he used with me at that time that was not Odin. And since then, when he re-entered my life, 13 going on 14 years ago at this point, he let me know that that had been him. But the way circumstances were in my life at that time, I was not ready for that kind of a commitment to an otherworldly relationship, or even that kind of a commitment to a deity. I'm not proud of saying that. I really think it's rather terrible. But at that point, I was under the influence of my mother, who didn't believe in these kinds of things and was very hard to talk to about them. And I had one person I had spoken to about these things, and then our friendship broke up, so that wasn't a source of support for me anymore. And then I had my future, now ex-husband, mortal husband, had entered my life, and he was trying to convince me that these entities I was interacting with were space aliens or something like that, which is very reminiscent of the Catholic Church claiming they were demons. So I wasn't strong enough to hold on to that at that point. I was in my early 20s, and I ended up getting married to this man and having a daughter and raising her. And years later, I went back to school and got my degree. Years later, it was fear that kept me from this, and who knows what would have happened if I had fully embraced that experience and that relationship at that time. I certainly would not be in the position I'm in today, and I would not have the relationships that I have today, including Jolene. So I can't really regret it, yet at the same time, I am not the least bit happy about the fact that I just let that go and didn't hold on to it and didn't make it the center of my life at that point in time. And I'm lucky, incredibly lucky, that he did give me a second chance. And this happened years later in my mid-30s, which is like 13 years ago. I'm 50 now. It's like 13 going on 14 years ago right now. And I was going through a low period of my life. I was having trouble in my marriage. My daughter was a young teenager, 15 or so. I think 14 or 15. And a couple of things happened. One was that, as I mentioned in a previous video, I came across the book American Gods by Neil Gaiman in a bookstore. I had never heard of the author before. The book meant nothing to me, but I was drawn to it, and I didn't know why. And I picked it up, took it home with me, paid for it, of course. And the character of Mr. Wednesday just spoke to something in my soul. And of course the character was based on Odin, and later in the book it was revealed that it was him. And this just is, the fact that Neil Gaiman was able to evoke Odin so powerfully in that novel gives me such respect for him as a, not only respect for him as a writer, but for the craft of writing and the ability to, and I'm sure Jolene on her channel will have plenty to say about this in the future, the ability of writers to link into the spiritual if they're open to doing so. Because the act of writing is a form of trance, and sometimes it's even a form of trance possession, and that's utterly fantastic, I think. So, where was I? Hold on, I'm gonna drink. It's wine. So there was the book. There was that. There was also a statue that I came upon on eBay because I had started to meet a few local pagans, and because I had been more or less studying witchcraft on and off since around the age of 13, and I decided I was going to join an online cyber coven because I had just gotten introduced to the internet. I was late to that party. There was that, and then we met my ex-husband and I met a few local pagans and started hanging out with them on occasion. And so pagans love bling, as I'm sure you all know, and this is why I have the business that I do, where I make bling for you guys. And I had taken to browsing eBay, because I don't think Etsy was a thing yet, but I had taken to browsing eBay, looking at various jewelry and stuff. And I looked at statues one day, and there was this statue by Oberon Zell, and it was a statue of Odin with his ravens and wolves, and with, he's got a drinking horn and the sign of the Valknut. And something about this statue just, I suddenly needed to have it. So I ordered it. And when it arrived, I debated what I was going to do with it. I actually fleetingly thought of giving it to my ex, thinking that Odin was someone he could kind of jive with. But he really, later on, I'm glad I didn't. Of course, I'm glad I didn't for many reasons. But one of the more minor reasons, is that my ex later commented that he felt like Odin was a space alien, which is what he basically felt about all the pagan gods. So I kept it. And I ended up setting up a little shrine for it. It was my first Odin shrine. And I started talking to the statue and talking about all the things in my life that I was dissatisfied with and unhappy about. And I would confide my feelings to the statue. And one night things got so bad that I just said, Odin, can you help me? Are you there? Are you listening? Can you help me? And he answered. He answered. He answered very directly and very palpably and very tangibly. And from that point on, he was there. He was there. He was always present in my life. From that point on, very solidly and immediately present. And within a few weeks, I know I'm going to get, again, hate comments for this, because every time I mention Godspousery or deity marriage, I do. But within a week, and I did exactly the same thing. I'm never going to finish the sentence, guys. I did exactly the same thing I tell people not to do. I tell people all the time, don't rush into deity marriages. There is so much more going on than you think there is. There is no way to anticipate the changes that it's going to make in your life, especially when you're dealing with a deity such as Odin, who is pretty much change and upheaval incarnate in deity form. He comes into he is famous, and this is why many people avoid him. He is famous for coming into your life and turning it upside down and inside out. And this is exactly what he did with me. And instead of negotiating with him and setting limits, like I tell people to do all the time when people come to me and ask me for advice on Odin, instead of doing that, I said to him, I'm yours. Do with me as you will. And he did. He did. He remade my life from the bottom up completely.